cosmic horror mythos of H.P. Lovecraft have seemingly become an inescapable part of pop culture, an author inspired by the writings of creators such as Arthur McKen and Edgar Allan Poe, whose life was marked by tragedy, mental illness, and poverty, with works relegated to pulp magazines and small printings. His creations and the story of his life have grown in posthumous popularity from meager curiosities to full-on cultural phenomena, following a boom in scholarly interest in the 1970s, with his writing status as public domain allowing creators to transform and expand upon his works just as he wanted when he was alive, only now all over the world. It seems people from every country have made media based directly in his mythos or are just inspired by it. 2005's eternally classic Dark Corners of the Earth by British developer Headfirst Productions, many of Mexican-Canadian author Silvia Moreno Garcia's short stories such as In the House of the Hummingbirds, a slew of indie games with some particular standouts to me being Dusk by American developer David Zemansky and Chinese developer Meow Nature's Depersonalization, which has yet to release but caught my interest from its captivating demo alone and is a game I desperately hope gets more support in a proper professional English translation. And yeah, I'd be hunted to death if I didn't mention 2014's Bloodborne by Japanese developer From Software, because every trans girl I know besides myself has played it and will gaslight gatekeep girlboss me if I don't mention it. But something that I was sort of surprised to learn is that since the late 80s, there's been a whole subsection of Japanese pop culture strongly fascinated by Lovecraft, thanks primarily to Hobby Japan's localization of Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu tabletop RPG in 1986. It is, at the time I write this, the most popular TRPG in the country, beating out even the most popular domestic RPG, Sword World, and was so popular in its day that it received multiple Japan-only expansions, as well as localizations of many English expansions, and nowadays outsells every other language version of the game combined. It would not be a stretch to say it's synonymous with TRPGs in the country the same way Dungeons & Dragons is here in the United States. And when you think about it, it makes a whole lot of sense. To quote Janice Brown's excellent essay on the subject, shape-shifting monsters, cephalopodic intruders, hidden undersea layers, protagonists unable to escape disillusion, boundaries between human and non-human blurring and shifting, these brief descriptions may sound like something out of H.P. Lovecraft, yet all are to be found in Japanese tales of horror and the supernatural, often with origins in the pre-modern past. As she notes, many of these things can be found in Japanese tales both old and new, and so a large, ever-growing mythos in which these concepts are focal points, and one that is immensely expandable, would make sense to catch on and stay popular over the years, with Japanese creators wanting to intermix their own talents, creations, and artistic cultures with Lovecraft's world to create something new. It's only natural then that, following the influential brand Fairytale exploring more horror-driven and violent stories in the wake of 1991's catastrophic Saudi incident bringing tighter restrictions on sexual content, check out my video on the Ayayo-san series for a segment discussing that in greater detail, a couple of developers would come together to create a loving tribute, adapting from his classic tales into the format they knew best. 1994's Necronomicon. It's quite an early tribute too, being among the first dozen games to be based on the Cthulhu mythos in those slow early days, and one of the very notable ones, at least I think so, alongside 1992's Alone in the Dark and 1987's The Lurking Horror and Laplace's Demon. Yet despite this legacy and the fact it's still remembered fondly by some Japanese adventure gamers, it's basically unknown outside of small JP circles. Excepting a short YouTube video, the only non-Japanese discussion about the game that really seems to exist was a segment by noted French games journalist Florent Gauge on the French TV show Les Oublies de la Préhistoire by No Life, who ran a short 6-minute segment that ultimately found the game interesting and enjoyable. And that is well deserved, as despite some flaws, major and minor, Necronomicon is a fine horror game and a fascinating adaptation, deserving of far more attention than it's gotten thanks to the language barrier. It's stylistically gorgeous, musically haunting, and has a story that is both some peak pulp horror, but also has some interesting themes that go a wholly different direction than what you may expect from a Lovecraft story, reinterpreting the tale of Innsmouth into something familiar but fresh, drawing influence from Arrow horror and detective stories to create something that's thrilling from start to end. So, let's dive into what this game has to offer and talk about ancient gods, demonic rituals, church corruption, and fish people, all in a forgotten classic from 1994. Necronomicon takes place in the early 1900s and follows Jonathan Swift, a journalist from the London Gazette who's decided to take a vacation to a little-known secluded fishing town by the name of Arkham, both as a way to get away from his monotonous job, but also to dive deeper into a family tree he knows little of, with one of his only leads being that a woman in his history involved in a questionable marriage came from this small place. Warned by both his bus driver and a train station attendant of mysterious going-ons in the town and disappearances, he continues on and arrives safely despite the uncomfortable uncomfortable, hollow atmosphere of it all, checking into the Fishscale Inn run by the widowed Miss Hudson, and shortly thereafter meeting the few other people staying there. Professor Gardner, an old man with an outspoken disposition and fascination of the bizarre ruins in the land, and the mysterious Thomas, a man with unknown motivations and apparent ties to the Freemasons. Shortly thereafter, joined by Cordelia, an orphan with a mysterious past running the local Gilman House pub who Jonathan mutually falls in love with. What starts as a vacation with a side of genealogy and archaeology slowly grows in scope, as the four unravel more and more mysteries, starting with the discovery of ancient drawings idolizing fish people, expanding into a conspiracy involving a mysterious familicide of the prosperous Dunwich estate, a cult by the name of the Church of Dagon, and the meaning of Jonathan's bizarre nightmares that seem to offer a glimpse into his past and the past of Arkham, clarifying as much as they muddle with mysterious talk of deep ones, ancient gods, a corrupt church, and bizarre babble in a forgotten tongue. While the story borrows heavily from various Lovecraft novels to the point that it's more of a best-of collection rather than an adaptation of one Fang or a wholly original tale, if there is any dominant source I can point to, it's Shadow over Innsmouth. From characters to plot twists to themes and even some of the story structure, this game is not at all shy about its love for that particular book. As an early Lovecraft title, and particularly the first in this genre, it's not really surprising to me that scriptwriter Hirono Kenichi and director Kanasugi Hajime would, rather than work from some mythos and build an entirely original plot, choose the safe route instead and build off of the strong foundation the book presents and add in elements from there, incorporating concepts from the tabletop game that people were more likely to have gotten their Lovecraft fix from at that time, and restructuring the entire plot in a way designed specifically to function with the ADV game genre. Hence, instead of a story about the fear of other, of humanity overstepping their bounds by, race mixing? God, what the fuck, Phillips? We get a detective story that grapples with some of the same concepts that concern Lovecraft, and many wholly different, but all handled from a very grounded perspective, and I think that's part of what separates Necronomicon from a lot of other Lovecraft media. This story doesn't really concern itself with what I would consider the core atmospheric elements of a Lovecraft story, namely isolation and cosmic horror, in the same way that the novel does. The cosmic bits are used for dramatic tension and for metaphor for very different themes in the novel, and the structure of the plot is more traditional horror, built on the backdrop provided by the tabletop game and many story beats of the novel to present its own completely unique themes, those primarily being the way that predatory and abusive systems lead to inevitable mass destruction and the overcoming of cycles of past tragedy and trauma, all in the format of a horror mystery novel, which I think is a genuinely cool way to adapt Shadow over Innsmouth, and even if I wasn't expecting it going in, which did lead to some disappointment as plot reveals became very predictable to me, the way they were purposed and adapted kept my interest, as did the very strong writing, excellent foreshadowing and scene setting from the very start that culminates in some pretty cool ways come the endgame, great plot reveals at just the right moment, and many interesting threads carefully wound together into one cohesive work. It's all very solidly executed. Equally as important as those, and another thing that kept my interest strong besides the fascinating direction it takes its themes and concepts, is the quartet of main cast members. A lovable old man, a mysterious middle-aged dude with a Giga Chad chin, a cold bartender woman, and a detective journalist who's somewhere between a Lovecraft and some of Edogawa Rampo's protagonists. I think the one who really steals the show is Professor Gardner. I'm usually not huge on crotchety old man type characters, especially in some anime where they can quickly devolve into horny stereotypes, but Gardner's just a fucking blast of how eager he is to investigate the land and how much he loves archaeology. The contrast of bitter old man and giddiness over an interest is super moe, and there's a lot of great moments that play off of his interests and general knowledge of the field that make him not just a useful asset to the party, but highly entertaining whenever he's on screen. Thomas is a lot of fun as well, though more so in a hateable way, as he's kind of just a smug ass who always seems to have a card up his sleeve. The script walks this very fine balance where he's consistently a useful asset, yet always feels as if he's on the verge of doing something shady, but doesn't quite pull through with it even when you think he will, thus keeping tensions from completely plummeting anytime he's around, but it doesn't become so consistently tense that it turns dull. Oddly enough, I think I have the least to say about ostensibly the two most important characters, since they're both just plainly good. Jonathan is a great lead with an interesting motivation, just some guy who wanted to do a vacation and do a little digging but gets wound up in a mystery he can't look away from, and Cordelia serves the role of a solid love interest, even if I wish she had more to do in the story other than be a motivation for our lead. But the two do have a genuinely good, if cliche, romantic dynamic, and by the end of it all, I found myself cheering for them to live on together. Each of the cast have very strong chemistry with the others, and and different overlaps and conflicts of interest that very much give off the feeling that the idea for this is based on a tabletop session the developers had. Once everyone becomes acquainted with each other, there is some very natural and entertaining chemistry between them that you don't often see in earlier ADV games like this. Jonathan almost always maintains this cool veneer of a collected man, attempting to solve mysteries and put things together, which aids the aforementioned romance of Cordelia, and is fun with Gardner responding in total disbelief to some of his more outrageous claims about the happenings of Arkham. Thomas speaks like a total arrogant asshole, which Gardner responds to like a bitter old man with venom in his speech, and Jonathan's just kind of concerned about. They're not groundbreaking dynamics, but they are very well thought through and entertaining to watch unfold and grow as the plot goes on, and that's helped a lot by how unique each of them feel and how good their dialogue always is. That is to say nothing of the supporting cast, the inhabitants of Arkham themselves. Many of them have no interest in helping Jonathan, and in fact, in the spirit of the novel, actively dislike the presence of him and his party snooping into matters of Arkham, made apparent very early on from the fact that some of them attempt to start a fight at the bar after Jonathan mentions the Innsmouth look to Cordelia, after another villager says he has it. That man, Marsh, is probably the closest thing this story has to a normal traditional Lovecraft character, taking on the role of the rambly old village man, and he might be my favorite side character in the game. Or maybe it's one of the villains, or one of the characters you don't meet who are responsible for some of these events being set into motion. I genuinely think that everyone here is compelling, even if they can become a bit cartoonish at the very end game. I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight just how readable the whole thing is too. Each character has a very distinctive voice and feel to their dialogue, and not just through accents, though this game does make pretty liberal use of Kansai dialect. One can generally follow the dialogue without having to glance at the name text, and it goes a long way to aiding the natural flow of banter and heady discussions, something this game desperately requires as it's chocked so full of text that a full playthrough can take anywhere from 12 to 20 hours depending on your fluency in Japanese and how much optional text you read. While that might sound short now, as VNs are anywhere from 20 to 100 hours long, keep in mind that is abnormally long for a game of this era, most of which can be beaten in less than 10 hours, quite a few in less than 5. I played this game focusing mostly only on what was absolutely necessary to read for progression and clocked in about 19 hours, with a read out loud playthrough on YouTube by a native reader with some exploration and a few scenes cut taking 13 or so, and a normal speed native playthrough taking 11. Much of that time is spent reading prose, which as well deserves praise for how well it manages to retain that Lovecraft feel of how his protagonists describe and think about things while being in a completely different language and still putting an ADV game type flavor onto it, resulting in this very neat hybrid of easily digestible and parsable language that relies on visuals as much as it does text, with flowery, sometimes abstract descriptions of things, especially in the dream sequences where the scene setting can feel almost novellic. It can also get very long-winded, also in typical ADV game fashion, and I guess Lovecraft as well, though at least this game doesn't really do the whole "this object is so indescribable that I'm going to spend an entire page talking about how indescribable it is" bit. Even if it does fall into the ADV game trap of absurdly long-winded descriptions of very mundane things, which, now that I think about it, that's also kind of a Lovecraft thing. These moments are few and far between though, which is a very good thing given that this title is a lot more hardcore in the adventure game elements than any other game I've covered on my channel at this point. Based on the systems that Fairytale built with the Nightmare Collection titles, Dead of the Brain 1 and 2 and Marine Fillet, it's a straightforward first-person adventure title in which you click on objects and environments of interest to gain insight into the world and find vital discoveries, people to talk to, keys and so on, and move between various areas of a map using the knowledge and items gained to proceed forward. By far the smartest mechanic present, and one that's carried over straight from Dead of the Brain 2, is that valid objects are highlighted as you mouse over them. No need to mindlessly mash on things in Pixel Hunt, the game just straight up tells you what you are and aren't allowed to examine with these pop-up boundaries, which kind of works from a character standpoint too. Jonathan's a journalist, so it makes sense he'd have a discerning eye for what is and isn't important. It doesn't entirely solve the problem, as it can be difficult to get the game to accept you are actually hovering over an object, a particularly frustrating problem in the few arrow scenes present, but for the most part it does a very good job at keeping the pacing of the gameplay on track, as does the fact that the game is generally quite linear, both in that there's mostly only a single route, and that it tends to keep you on a straight path. You do have some freedom of movement in that you can explore Arkham freely once you've acquired a map about a third of the way through, but the game will almost always have some character hint at or just outright say where you need to go to proceed, and you'll often get locked in place until you've done everything necessary in the area to proceed, so you don't accidentally leave and wonder what you're supposed to do next. If you ask me, I think this is the best compromise between the modern visual novel format and the classic ADV game style. Much like Dokusei, which I looked at a few months back, you're not pressured into interacting with everything in the game. Things are there if you want to get some additional information about the world, or if you want some fun references, which there are plenty of if you're familiar with Lovecraft's other works, but you aren't being demanded to examine every little object to move forward, even when the thing you may have missed has no connection to the plot at hand. There's also no puzzles, another thing you'd probably expect to be in an adventure game, which I realize may be a disappointment to people watching this familiar with the other Lovecraft games of the era, as two of the biggest ones, Alone in the Dark and Shadow of the Comet, are primarily driven by them, but I can't say I see this game being benefited by the presence of them whatsoever if it did have them. In my experience, Necronomicon is the earliest Lovecraft title one can play now and not feel as if they're getting something horribly antiquated. While I appreciate the two aforementioned games for their place in history, they feel like pieces of history, with Alone in the Dark in particular feeling clunky to an aggravating extent, and this is coming from someone who likes tank-control survival horror in most cases. I also can't say I was a fan of Shadow of the Comet with its immensely awkward UX that made me feel like I had no control half the time. Comparatively, the quality of life additions over some other ADV games and simple design here makes this about as approachable as an indie game styled after this era, even if that means far less actual quote-unquote gameplay than other titles. This is a game where it exists exclusively as a way to give the player involvement in how things proceed and to make them feel like they have some sort of agency. And I'm totally fine with that as someone who primarily plays games for stories and vibes now. And man, this game has some good horror vibes. Even if I'd struggle to call it cosmic horror in the way that something like Color Out of Space is, one thing this title adapts perfectly from Lovecraft's stories like that is the kind of subtle, under-your-skin style of horror, where every new paragraph, every flip of the page, has you on the edge of your seat not for a big scare, but because you're in a perpetual state of equal parts curiosity and discomfort, compelled to see what's coming next by the narrative, but scared of what that might entail. And while it was rare that Lovecraft allowed himself to resolve that fear of massive scares, Necronomicon is not shy to have its graphics, audio, and writing all come together at points that deliver some pretty memorable and powerful frights, capitalizing on the atmosphere and the benefits of this medium. There's a couple that genuinely disturbed me, and they wouldn't be so strong if the game didn't use that subtle horror to set the stage. It helps too that this has a very slow pace compared to the breakneck speed of some other VNs from the era. It takes a while for all the threads of the mystery to come together, and in that time it keeps things interesting by dealing them out at a regular pace alongside solid character drama and world building, making the runtime feel not padded, but rather a deliberate move to keep the horror potent and the atmosphere steady. Of course, a lot of said atmosphere comes from how brilliantly realized the locales are. Big shout out to the Miskatonic University Library. It feels like a perfect microcosm of what Lovecraftian horror is to me. It's this unknowable, almost inhuman library of an impossible to comprehend scale, a database of knowledge shrouded in darkness, much of which exists nowhere else, that would take multiple lifetimes to even see part of. It is some genuinely brilliant subtle horror. I love the historic ruins as well and how bizarrely out of place they are for Arkham, looking almost Greek with the carvings themselves seemingly inspired by Incan art. I suppose now would be a good time to address that this game is way less racist than the original book. There's no overarching theme about race mixing being bad, as the Deep Ones are just outright demonic movie monster creatures, mostly controlled by white people rather than being a metaphor for non-white people. There's far less racism against Native Americans, as the fish-worshipping native people that the villains find are just some group of native people on an unnamed island, which is still not perfect, but far better than outright calling Melanesian natives devil worshippers. We even get an Asian American main character of Cordelia, adopted by a couple born in Arkham, with the story sometimes touching on her being one of the very few non-white people in the backwoods town, yet she's still treated with respect by the town as a whole. In particular, there's some small conversations I love where Miss Hudson, the innkeeper, is really protective of her. I do wish she was a stronger character overall, as she ends up being reduced to a damsel at points, but she and the other women in the story are far from the worst I've seen in this medium, let alone in media in general. I'm unsure exactly how much research was done when writing the script, but at the very least, the developers did enough to avoid reiterating Lovecraft's racism, creating an atmosphere that feels suitably like being in a small American or British village, and is more than capable of breaking that when possible to establish that Arkham is a bizarre, wrong place filled with horrible things, without making those horrible things something bigoted, instead using a methodical slow pace and brutal imagery, channeling much more reasonable emotions. Man, this whole fucking game just looks so good and unique. I do absolutely love the pseudo-lo-fi anime look that most games on the platform use. The way artists managed to use a mere 16 colors on screen to create some absolutely gorgeous and outstanding artwork that mimics the styles and palettes of animated films and broadcast shows at the time is immensely impressive to me. But there's also just something special about how this game goes against the grain. The art is certainly stylized, and to great effect, but it's far more grounded and realistic, eschewing traits that one would tend to associate with anime art of the time: big eyes, sharp lines, bright and blooming colors, and defined body features, in favor of a more rounded and gritty look that reminds me a lot of the Patlabor movies of all things, oddly enough. The colors, too, are a lot moodier than one would normally expect, of aquatic greens and blues and grim browns and blacks that all come together to set a darker tone, reserving bright colors for scenes the developers seemingly wanted to have a more unique feeling. Most noticeable in dream sequences that have these gloomy, isolating, soft blues and whites. I also have to mention the very clear HR Giger inspirations in the artwork, particularly the borders here. These have basically nothing to do with the story of the game, but they are around, and they look pretty cool in that very extra way that PC-98 borders tend to be, even if it's made this video a complete and utter pain in the ass to edit. Though you can see the inspiration in other things as well, particularly the design of the deep ones here, which I absolutely love. I'm sure everybody has their favorite Lovecraft aesthetic, that one piece of media that really gets the feelings they personally experience when reading, and for me, it's this game with a palette that really helps to capture those feelings of loneliness, fear, and curiosity. And then there's the CGs themselves. I've gushed about the locales enough, but beyond that, there's some almost cinematic shots, like the semi-fisheye of the Dunwich Manor living room that gives off these unnerving vibes, the way it uses long, scrolling CGs for dramatic effect, or like, this fucking shot? There's also a pretty incredible amount of art just overall, which keeps the game from ever feeling visually samey. It really feels like the developers wanted to use every element of the medium together to capture the same vibes as horror cinema, much like they tried to do with the Dead of the Brain games, and I think they absolutely succeeded at it, even if it does get a bit silly towards the end. It's at this point that I'm going to talk about the themes of the story, the darker elements, and basically spoil the entire thing for anyone who hasn't played it or read the book. So if you don't want to know the major beats of Necronomicon, or major spoilers for Shadow over Innsmouth, then skip to the timecode on screen. I'm also going to be going into the Edo and Edo horror parts of the game as they're integral to the plot, so if you're sensitive to gore, sexual violence, or horrendously mediocre vanilla sex scenes, then I also highly recommend skipping ahead. After this quick break sponsored by my lovely supporters. So, I don't have a ton to say this time unlike usual, though I guess I'll say I sorta went back on that whole not gonna review serious games in Japanese thing. As I note later in this video, I found this game surprisingly comprehensible and decided why not give reading the whole thing and talking about it a try. I do gotta give a special thanks to a few people. Castell helped with fact-checking me and providing pointers for research, and I also have to shout out some of the X-No-Life crew for being cool about me using clips from them. People like to shitpost about the French, but I think they're pretty cool. As per usual, thanks to all of my incredible supporters. If it weren't for the lovely people whose names are on screen right now, I wouldn't be able to make videos like these like I do, and as the funding grows, so too does the scope of content I can cover. We're at $80 a month between Patreon and Kohi, and even more if you count in the one-time donations people make, which is... it's just seriously fantastic. I wasn't expecting the channel to get to 900 subscribers either. Like, man, this is just wonderful. If you want to help me out and want your name on the screen, then consider donating either monthly or one time. Your name will appear on the screen either way, monthly for as long as you donate and one time for the next video, but there's no pressure either way. Even just liking, sharing, subscribing, and or commenting is a huge help and keeps me motivated to keep making on videos about old Eroge and VNs. Again, thanks everybody, and back to the show. Again, if you don't want spoilers or any of the sensitive content, skip to the timecode on screen. So, in order for this to make sense, I need to recap the story. Picking up from the synopsis I gave earlier, where we find out Jonathan has deeper ties than first fought to the town of Arkham, the presence of ruins of ancient fish people worship, that there's a mysterious cult run by a man by the name of Nye, and with the party of 4 fully assembled, they set out to talk to Marsh, the man who told Jonathan he has the Innsmouth look. He explains that it's mostly a thing of prejudice against outsiders after an incident that happened years back, where the son of the foreign and rich Dunwich family, Delarey, violently murdered his family before killing himself. himself, a case which the court ruled is caused by insanity. This leads the group to explore the once Dunwich-owned and now defunct Miskatonic University in search of court records, with one particular book giving more facts behind the murder and 2 important details: the name of Deloree's father, Phillips, and the family's role in bringing money to the financially struggling village, once called Innsmouth according to a map in Deloree's former room in the library. After going to the graveyard to see the graves of the Dunwich family in person, the group learns from the gravekeeper that just a single one was buried, and that his close friend Marsh holds not only the keys to the estate, but was also given control of many of the family's assets following Deloree's demise. Returning to him, he hands the keys over while confiding the group about his history as a good friend of Deloree, assuring them that he wasn't insane like the courts claimed and that there's more to the case. It's at this point that while the group is digging deeper into the conspiracy and finding more about the family, John's dreams start to become more and more vivid, with some even showing him a vision of the past involving nuns at the Miskatonic Monastery that now sits scorched on the hill, but one seems to have possibly been a target of spying from the Catholic Church from 2 agents, Lucienne and Sarah. Vague and confusing at first, it's only after the death of Marsh and after the group visits the wrecked monastery and Jonathan realizes they're in the same room he dreamt women being tortured by fish creatures in, that he faints again into another dream. On a snowy, clouded day, as the nuns are gathered around and discussing rumors of spies, one of them spots the corpse of a woman who had gone missing for 6 months. Laying near death in the snow with empty eyes, looking akin to a victim of strangulation at first glance, but as Lucienne and Sarah discover, the telltale signs of it are missing, with bizarre stretch marks akin to a pregnant woman's branded into her stomach. The nuns gather around and watch as Angelica, a woman in the first flashback, watches them alongside Pietro, discussing how this might affect their plan, before all of them gather around in service to honor the death of the woman, Hannah, with Nye at the helm of it alongside Angelica. After Jonathan recovers and has a brief chat about Cordelia's forgotten past and cut ties to the Church of Dagon with Miss Hudson, the group goes back to the graveyard to question the gravekeeper about the things they've seen, learning that the runes not only aren't original, but were brought over by Phillips, whose corpse was ordered burned by the court alongside the rest of the family, only one of Deloree's daughters spared, and that the graveyard's barrenness comes from the fact that people don't seem to die here, they just disappear as they age. Some of this seems to be owed to the cult, which most of the city began to believe in after they promised economic prosperity to the then dying Arkham, and before they knew it, were in it for the long run, with Jonathan that night finding Cordelia missing from the Gilman house and now at their altar, seemingly drugged and intended to be used as a sacrifice for their cause. When she comes to in her room with no recollection of the event, John urges her to escape with him back to London for their safety, only to find a bridge to the outside world damaged and unusable, but not by the storm, by intentionally being cut. The two decide to rest for the night and attempt to escape by the old railway in the morning, and Jonathan experiences another dream, once again following the nuns. After Lucienne wakes Sarah from a nightmare of being tortured, she's called out of her room by unknown orders of another nun and promises she'll be back in the morning. Of course, she fails to return, which leads to Sarah to start investigating into matters herself, hearing rumors going around of more nuns going missing and notably of odd inhuman sounds in the basement. Going to investigate, she finds men from outside the monastery moving a casket into the basement and, more pressingly, Nye and Pietro talking together about how to wake their master with the help of the forbidden book, the Necronomicon, right before Lucienne is tortured by Pietro and Angelica. Waking from the dream, the two find themselves under attack by the same mysterious fish-like monsters Jonathan saw in his nightmares, escaping back to the hotel and pressing the other two to help them find the forbidden book, which they reluctantly agree with, and eventually find hidden in Deloree's room in the university, along with the long-lost key to his study in the manor. Of course, Thomas finally shows his true form as a villain of the story, hoarding Cordelia at gunpoint and threatening to kill her if he's not given the book, as it holds not only the keys to summoning the elder god Cthulhu, a god with the power to forever change the world, but supposedly to controlling him, something that both the Church of Dagon and Thomas desire for themselves. With no other choice, Jonathan hands him the book and he rebukes on his word and takes Cordelia too, dropping his pistol unloaded behind him, as he runs off to begin the summoning ceremony. The two make a run for it to catch up but ultimately fail, and Jonathan once again faints, and is confronted by the mysterious voice of his dreams and is given one final vision of the monastery's past. Picking up from the last, Lucienne is seen shackled to the wall and arguing with Pietro and Angelica about the facts of the situation, and revealing to her the intention to use sacrifices to summon Cthulhu and control him, unveiling a deep one right in front of her that they intend to use to breed her, only for Angelica to be pulled away too, having served her purpose and being reduced from a head of the affair to just more stock for the rituals, just like the woman in the very intro of the game was. After they're assaulted, Pietro continues to deride them, insulting them both as disgusting and subhuman, before Lucien's cries for Sarah are heard and she attacks him, rendering him unconscious. Holding Lucien in her arms, she explains to Sarah the entire situation, the forced breeding of the Deep Ones, the plot to resurrect an ancient god, and gives her one final dying request: to burn the entire monastery down, killing everyone in it to ensure these mistakes can't be repeated. Pained but not regretful and holding on to Lucien's last words asking her to find happiness in a sinful world, she scorches the entire place to the ground, almost killing everybody involved. Once again awake and being forced to escape from their apartment by a horde of now alert Deep Ones, Jonathan and Gardner make their way to acquire ammo and to open the one remaining room in the manor, containing Deloree's diary that confirms his motives in the familicide, having watched one of his own children, the older daughter Lorena, transform into a Deep One. According to the journal, the record of the book in the library about Phillips being supposedly shipwrecked and missing for a long time before washing up on Arkham doesn't tell the whole truth, as in the time he was away, he made contact with an unknown group of native people who cooperated with the Deep Ones and provided sacrifices to them in exchange for prosperity and goods, as well as breeding with them to create hybrids that would return to sea when they reach middle age, and used this knowledge to offer wealth and goods to the people of Arkham with the Church of Dagon, as well as subjecting his own wife to the horrors of the Deep Ones in order to continue the bloodline of the Pledged One, the one who may eventually help Cthulhu rise from his slumber, resulting in the birth of Deloree. Not wanting to allow Philip's plans to raise Cthulhu to come to fruition, he killed himself and the rest of his family before it was too late. Jonathan, realizing he's of the same creed, rushes to the graveyard to dig up the corpse of Hannah to confirm the legitimacy of the diary and finds her corpse, partly transformed into that of a Deep One. The revelation bringing back a childhood memory of his mother sick of a mysterious illness that had deformed her body into a bizarre fish creature. As they're about to head back to confront Thomas, Nye stops them and confirms the whole story with Jonathan, as well as that the woman he came here to search for, the woman that ties him back to this place, is Sarah, whom Phillips had been with for a time, leaving Jonathan as the last relative of the Pledged One after Deloree's passing, with the voice in his head revealed as a part of him that desires to fulfill his place in the resurrection, pushing him to give into his lineage. He's left with one final choice: to kill Nye and embrace his position with the cult, or to reject his heritage and save the world. The good ending follows the latter, with Jonathan shooting Nye almost dead and rushing to save Cordelia of Gardner, going to the one passage they hadn't yet explored in the manor and finding the Deep Ones gathered together in a ceremony to raise Cthulhu, with Thomas at the center of it. Him and Jonathan briefly scuffle before Gardner tackles him, getting stabbed in the process but buying Jonathan enough time to grab and wake Cordelia, and for the old men to die together, landing in the void of the Necronomicon. Escaping through the tunnel and shooting the shambling Nye dead for good, the two escape by boat and make their way towards London. Ending the story with Arkham finally destroyed, the cycle ended, and the two able to live on happily ever after. I wasn't joking when I said this ending is pretty silly. Like, this is really fun, but it's basically just Indiana Jones of a Resident Evil 4 boat ride. So, there's a lot to unpack here, but I want to start with how interesting this game is as an adaptation. Having read Shadow over Innsmouth and various other Lovecraft stories to understand the world better before going in, and inadvertently spoil myself, which did disappoint me a bit, I was constantly taking note of how events were altered or wholly recontextualized and how characters were reused or made absent. Phillips and Marsh take on the roles of Obed and Zadok respectively, multiple key events such as the lynching are recreated, albeit with massively different context, and the major plot reveals revolving around Jonathan are similar to Robert's, namely him sharing a bloodline with people deeply connected to the Deep Ones, and his initial motivation is very similar, though obviously diverges quite a bit in time. And I will say that one thing Shadow does better than this is keeping the pacing up in the end. There's a whole load of exposition dumped in the last quarter or so here that try to clarify the plot and wrap it up, almost like the writers weren't really sure how to close off the story, which, hey, solidarity of tabletop DMs also not knowing how to finish their stories properly, but it just slows the pace from methodical to absolutely sluggish at points. I wouldn't ever say it gets bad story-wise, as the exposition is interesting and has some incredible reveals that tie it all together, but I think they could have extended the end and changed the order of events so things were slowly revealed at the same steady pace as before, with the last section being a fast-paced race to the finish line against Thomas and Nye, with maybe just one or two plot reveals. If there is something that's an undeniable negative in the game though, it's the goddamned hunt for the book. For whatever reason, the game just abruptly decides to go full full treasure hunt mode and task you with finding the Necronomicon, except the problem is, even if you know where it is by way of a guide, Jonathan just acts like a fucking brat and refuses to look at it, forcing the player to examine nearly everything in the game to proceed. None of the guides online seem to know exactly what triggers the end sequence, and frankly, I don't either, but my best guess is that you need to examine everything in every location that could even be tangentially related to the Dunwich incident, the refinery, the university, the estate, and the monastery, and then suddenly Jonathan decides he's okay with looking at the fireplace that's next to the book hidden in the wall. I could be wrong though, maybe you do have to examine every single object and talk to everyone. I gave up and did that after trying everything that made sense to me. This section is just atrocious and completely wrecks the otherwise fantastic pacing of the story, far more than the info dumps ever could. Well, I guess the not-horror age scenes are also kind of an issue. These play out every couple of nights with Cordelia with, frankly, no justification other than they wanted to fuck, and at the brothel with the justification that Jonathan wanted to keep an eye out on Thomas as he's seen him sneaking out to the church and discussing of nigh ones, and then he snuck out to the brothel, which, like, that does actually make some logical sense. That tracks, but holy shit does it hit out of nowhere just walking into one and watching John get it on with some borderline one-dimensional characters. If you've watched my videos before, you know I'm someone who genuinely really tries to see the positive to having erotic content in the game, and for the most part, I think it's a part of eroge as a genre that genuinely has great potential to contribute to the plot and is unfairly generalized as fan service by certain groups of players. But these are not that, they're just nothing. There's nothing hot to them, and except for the one time that Cordelia dumps plot details out of nowhere, they contribute nothing to the story. They're just skippable filler. However, it's the bits unique to this story and the way it remixes Lovecraft's writing that I think makes it truly worth playing. Most notably, the way it turns the Church of Dagon from a background element in Shadow to a driving thematic force, digging deeper into their attempts to tamper with things beyond comprehension and the human sacrifices they make in the name of it, and uses it to explore cults and cycles of trauma and abuse. The ultimate goal of the Church of Dagon in this story is just two things: to continue the bloodline of the people of Innsmouth and Deep Ones, and to bring upon the resurrection of their ancient god Cthulhu, bringing the world under their control with his might. And to accomplish those, the cult uses women as breeding stock to continue the lineage and create new subjects, furthering the chances of success. And it doesn't shy away from showing the horrors and consequences of a system built on brutality using a juxtaposition of eroticism and horror. The dreams that Jonathan is forced to witness show how painful and traumatic the experiences are, and in a contrast to the boring real-world H scenes, these are legitimately well-written and solid parts of the horror experience, and touch on how fucked up all this is for the women forced into submission, something that Lovecraft really only alluded to. The dreams that occur throughout the game, of course, contextualize this with the aforementioned plot regarding the spies from the Catholic Church, Sarah and Lucienne, as they slowly put together what's going on and realize that disappearances are far more than just simple missing persons cases, with the first scene that really sells us being the appearance of Hannah's corpse for how perfectly it encapsulates what really makes the erotic elements of the horror work here. The solemn music, the devoid and hollow coloring, the brutal destruction of her body juxtaposed with a sense of artistic eroticism in the camera work and pose. It creates this unique blend of discomfort and fear, playing on deep, innate emotions and desires that many people experience to bring a horribly unique feeling of disgust to fruition, evoking the same feelings that works like Edgar Allan Poe's The Caterpillar give me. Like those, there is ultimately nothing erotic here, nor in the other era horror sequences, not in a pleasurable sense. They are microcosms of the harm that these organizations perpetuate, of blatant corruption and callousness, a representation of the damage done by uncaring systems who seek to use people as fuel for a cause that brings death and eats itself, to bring power to something they don't realize they can't control once it begins, whether that be an ancient god or further cycles of destruction. A perfect example of how little these systems care for others, even cooperators, is what happens to Angelica. She spends most of her time in a church of a haughty attitude, comfortable in her position as a higher-up and using it to taunt others, delighting in the torture of those below, before she too is apprehended and thrown into the same position that every other nun will inevitably be used for, all while questioning why this is happening to her despite her loyalty and service to those above. The people at the head of this cult and all cults do not care about people below them. They don't care about their cooperators and their members members, they are creators of uncaring systems that devour themselves to feed a selfish desire. And while the game portrays this as a somewhat cartoonish need to control everything, it isn't far off from how real cults take advantage of people, especially emotionally or financially vulnerable people such as those of Arkham, for the sake of power, political, emotional, sexual, or financial, and forcing people to commit horrible acts or be victim to, all while promising brotherhood under a united goal, claiming that everything will work out if they just follow the plan, just expanded into a grand scale for the sake of making an entertaining horror story. Like real cults, the people involved were just normal people. They began to believe out of fear of being unable to survive as crops of fish, their main export, dried up. And then here comes this new religion that tells them they can continue to be prosperous as long as they obey and do what they're told. And with how dire the stakes were, why wouldn't they want that chance to survive? They preyed on their financial and, by extension, emotional insecurity, in a way also not unlike how modern-day conspiracy theories such as the racist and anti-Semitic QAnon prey on the insecurities of people scared of a complex and ever-shifting political climate by giving them vague yet simple answers, painting often innocent and unrelated targets as malicious ringleaders of wholly falsified crimes on hot-button issues to give a sense of control. These people, both the fictional subjects here and the real people indoctrinated into cults and theories, simply aren't going to stop believing the moment it turns out one part of their claim doesn't come to fruition, no matter how integral it is, because they're already absorbed into with no root out of the belief system that has warped their view of the world, one that even their friend groups and family may now be communally bonded over, in the same way the village of Arkham is bonded over to Church of Dagon, and there's nothing there to help them out of it. Something that we, despite the fact that seemingly more people than ever have fallen into these traps, still lack sufficient support in communities for. However, Necronomicon is optimistic in that it believes even the most extreme of these, a literal fucking death cult worshipping an ancient fish god, don't have to be perpetuated forever. While imperfectly, Sarah managed to find the courage, thanks to her, superior? God, this seems really fucking gay. To burn it all down. And even if she failed, it at least set the stage for it to be finally ended by Jonathan, someone who is, by right of blood, given an opportunity to join in the same cycle that Sarah fought to end, but instead forges his own path, destroying the cult in the process. And I think this is the intended reading given the content of the game's bad ending, where Jonathan gives in and joins Nye, rushing to the ritual site to find Thomas with his left arm and both legs severed. Jonathan laughs at him as Thomas remarks he isn't the same person anymore, that something is different. Accepting that it'll turn into a deep one, he torments Thomas by grabbing his exposed organs, coating his hands in blood, and sealing his fate as he transforms horrifically into one of the creatures and assaults Cordelia, all to aid in summoning Cthulhu. Except it doesn't go to plan. Much to Nye's panic, he doesn't awaken. Jonathan, now having completely lost his humanity, lashes out at Nye, who assures him that they can try again, that they can succeed. No matter the day or the century, they can start from the beginning and do it right, as nuns begin to pour into the city, now with a rebuilt monastery. It's a short ending, but it's one that really sells the themes of the work to me. The lengths at which Jonathan will go to bring success to a plan that he's told will grant him infinite power, the horrible transformation he goes under from human to monster, and the mutilation of the one he loved, all for a ritual that ultimately fails and leaves him with nothing but a new cycle of horror to contribute to. It's a very unique avenue for a Lovecraftian work. It isn't really about isolation or insignificance, it's a story about how systems built on the abuse of others will inevitably lead to self-destruction, no matter how much power you believe you'll have over the stage you've set. And it's about ending cycles of trauma and tragedy, moving beyond your past and overcoming inhuman horrors to save yourself and those who can be saved from systems that seek to destroy them. While I can't pretend that this game is a perfect exploration of those themes, or that in general it's some forgotten amazing critique that bread tubers will come buckets over, stay tuned for my eventual videos on Anuki-Tashi games, which are definitely not forgotten, but definitely worth coming buckets both literal and political to. They are well-realized themes that add an impressive amount of weight to scenes like the burning of the monastery and Jonathan realizing his past. Scenes that, along with the discovery of Hana or Jonathan's corruption and the bad ending, genuinely hit me hard and made me invigorated to see it through to the end, even as the pacing began to slow. It also impresses me the way in which this game manages to handle its use of sexual violence in the story. In general, it's dangerous ground to tread on, because a writer can very easily use it as a crutch to tell the audience that this group is bad, you shouldn't like them, in a cheap, offensive, and misogynistic way, which Lovecraft handily avoided by just not talking about this. And for clarity, this game isn't perfect with women. The Erogudo scenes can be more graphic than necessary, Jonathan's attitude towards Cordelia can on odd occasions be harsh in ways that I think I'm supposed to dislike, but I can't quite make it a bearing on the intent, and her being reduced to a damsel, even with her and the other women still being interesting characters, is pretty tropey. It's not perfect, but it's not bad either, and at least to me, it never came off as if the developers just hated women or something. However, as this particularly pertains to the way the story handles the church's dealings, I think it avoids coming off as offensive trite thanks to everything I've described before. It's not here just to sell that the cult is bad and evil, it's here because it's important to the themes. They commit these terrible acts believing it'll all come to a greater good when their god rises, just as they tell their unwitting subjects, and as we learn from the bad end, that's never going to happen. Attempting the resurrection results in Thomas being torn to pieces by the creatures he believed he controlled. Indulging in the cult turns Jonathan into a literal monster, and the ultimate result is that the resurrection fails and all the church can do is start from scratch, continuing a cycle that will do incalculable harm for the sake of chasing power, a cycle perpetuated by a system rotted to its core that cannot be reformed. And while you could tone down the explicitness of the assault scenes and lose nothing, I think the game would absolutely benefit from being more visually subtle with the monster torture. If you were to cut this whole thing about how the cult treats women out, I think you'd be left with a far less impactful story that doesn't say nearly as much about how horrible cults and abusive power structures truthfully are. Despite how dire and depressing all of this is, Necronomicon still somehow ends up being a far more hopeful tale than Shadow over Innsmouth, whereas that ends with the protagonists nearly killing themselves but opting not to and instead embracing their fate as a deep one following a mental breakdown. The good ending sees Jonathan getting to finish the work his ancestors started and end the suffering. Contrastingly, while Shadow's ending was shocking and impactful when I read it, it hasn't really stuck with me. Maybe it's because I'm not at a place in my life anymore where that sort of bleak, wholly hopeless outlook does anything for me. There's just something about Necronomicon's melancholic yet optimistic true ending, where Jonathan manages to bring closure to a horrific past and, as Lucien told Sarah, live and find happiness in a cruel, sinful world, even in spite of the terrible things that he's had to come to terms with and the traumatizing things he'd seen and experienced. That hits different for me. To sum it all up, Necronomicon is not exactly what I call a high art or high concept story. It is, at its heart, a pulp story that seeks to introduce Shadow over Innsmouth to an audience that might not have read it, and give those who have a wildly new take on it that I think ultimately comes together as a more enjoyable story now than Lovecraft's original writing is. I realize that's probably controversial to say, and maybe it's also just because I'm a huge dork obsessed with old computers and edo-gay, but the benefits of video games as a medium and the additions to the story made by the developers, I believe legitimately add up to make Necronomicon both more enjoyable as a story to read, and as something that's left me thinking about much more than the original. However, I will also own up to the fact that I did marathon Lovecraft for 24 hours straight with mediocre sleep in preparation for this video, so my brain might have been a bit fried as I was reading Shadow over Innsmouth and other tales. Regardless, I found Necronomicon a comparatively comfortable read despite me not being great at Japanese. There were some difficulties here and there and an adjustment period to get used to aspects of the language I wasn't yet familiar with, but I wouldn't call it a horribly challenging game. Except for this goddamn text box. Who designed this? I genuinely had to spend most of my time in the game not reading from the game's own text box, but the text hooker and dictionary I used. Actually, on the note of language, and before anyone asks, this game is sadly exclusively in Japanese with no unofficial translation in the works at the time of writing this, nor any sanctioned translation available. Though given the poor quality of VN localization work in the 90s, perhaps that's for the better? Who knows, maybe this video will spur some Japanese proficient horror fan to have a crack at it. If not, then maybe I'll do it myself given a year or free more practice and a mass amount of spare time. It does kind of surprise me this title hasn't been translated yet, despite being quite possibly one of the most Western-friendly story-driven games on the platform, with art and story that's more agreeable to your average retro gamer than most VNs of the era. It's almost a perfect gateway drug into Japanese computers. Still though, if you're gonna play this yourself and are proficient enough to be able to read it without such tools, then I honestly recommend sticking to the FM Towns port where they fix this issue by making it white text on pure black instead of white on dithered. And this version also includes a fully remade CD audio soundtrack as opposed to the original FM, which I'm honestly not sure which version I'd consider better. I haven't talked about it nearly enough up to this point since I couldn't think of where else to fit it in, but the music in this game absolutely sells the atmosphere with tracks that range from haunting, solemn pieces to unnerving and horrifying to something straight out of Castlevania. A lot of that comes from the brilliant use of European classical music theory all throughout in a number of ways, be it counterpoint to evoke a sense of sophistication or chord progressions and resolutions that conjure up images of works like Toccata and Fugue in D minor. It's a very distinct score that separates itself well from other incredible ADV game soundtracks. But then there's the CD music, which just listen to the town theme between the two and you'll get an idea of how different they are. I do believe the original score fits the atmosphere better, both in that FM synthesis is able of creating some truly surreal sounds and mimicking real ones in a way that is normally quite charming, but here adds the uncanny feeling of the atmosphere. But the CD soundtrack also expands greatly on the original score of added passages, live vocals, and some brilliant instrumentation. It completely changes the atmosphere of things in a way that I really like. Frankly, this combined with the fact that this version actually has facial animations kind of makes me wish I played it instead of the PC-98 floppy release, but the lack of text hooking with FM Towns emulation and my own stubborn preference for FM music landed me here instead. There is also a Windows 95 version that presumably has these changes too, and even voice acting according to an ad in my copy of Pia Carrot 2, but it's so rare that I couldn't find a disc image online and it sells for a couple hundred. Is what I would be saying if I didn't find an ISO literally as I was uploading the first draft of this video. So what does this elusive version contain? Well, for starters, it's a 16-bit application, so it just doesn't run on anything newer than Windows XP 32-bit, so text hooking is out of the window. And you also need a virtual machine with Japanese Windows, an old computer running Japanese Windows, or a build of DOSBox like DOS VAXJ free with Japanese support and a localized copy of Windows 3.1 to even get the installer to work. I like this artwork though. Wait, what do you mean voice actor, singular? What do you mean I need 256 color mode? Alright, let's just fix that and I made it worse! Yeah, I'm just using a VM, screw this. Now hey, it's got the better text box, but man, that is some crusty filtering. Why is everything made out of Vaseline? Wait, where's the animation from the Towns in 9821 version? Where's the voice acting?
So,
oh. Oh god. Oh, that's the only voice acting, it's just the voice in Jonathan's head. Yeah, don't play this part.
Oh.
I guess I should note that they did later make an enhanced version specifically for CD-equipped PC-98s, which comes with the extra animation and the new music, but doesn't have the fix-the-text box. What the hell, Fairytale? I guess when I inevitably replay this game, I will be doing so with the Towns release, but whether you choose to play the CD version or the original 98 floppy version, you won't be getting a bad experience. They're just different from each other. And that is how I would describe Necronomicon as a whole compared to other Lovecraftian adaptations. Different, and in this case, I think that's a breath of fresh air. While I came in expecting a fun but ultimately run-of-the-mill horror experience that attempts to tread on the same ground as the novels, I was pleasantly surprised by how fun the characters are, the eerie and unsettling atmosphere, and the direction the story went with its themes and how much they contribute to the experience. It's also a thoroughly interesting example of Japanese Lovecraft media. It's far from the first, the pleasure of which can be owed to, according to a great article by Sailing Gallery, drawn works like Footfalls from Below, Mizuki Shiedo's 1963 adaptation of Dunwich Horror, and gaming titles such as 1987's aforementioned Laplace Demon by Hummingbird Soft. It still holds a place as the first VN to tackle the mythos, something that other developers would try their hand at later down the road, perhaps most notably in What a Beautiful Tomorrow and the Demon Bane games. I'd be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to Fate Grand Order's story set in Salem as well, by far one of the best scenarios in the game. While I'm not sure if I would recommend this title to people who aren't fans of horror, I think those who are, and specifically enjoy the worlds that Lovecraft created, should absolutely give this game a try. With gorgeous artwork, a haunting score, and a captivating story that goes in directions one likely wouldn't expect, unless you've read Shadow over Innsmouth, Necronomicon had me invested from beginning to end and even got me hooked on the larger world of Lovecraft media. And that, I think, is the best compliment I can give to a game like this.